What we're looking at the moment are our acute responses to exercise. The term acute means immediate. So these are the things that will change in our body to enable us to undertake physical activity and allow us to perform at our desired levels. So the first couple of things that we ask ourselves is, when we start to exercise, what do we want to achieve? And we're looking at this from a physiological perspective, and really with respect to two systems. The first being our cardiorespiratory system, and the second being our muscular system. So looking at our cardiorespiratory, the first thing that we want to do is increase oxygen delivery. If we can increase more oxygen being delivered to our working muscles, then we can work at a higher aerobic intensity because we can produce more aerobic energy. If we are producing more aerobic energy, more waste product is being built up. So we also want to increase removal of wastes. Now, these wastes could be seen as either heat, carbon dioxide, water. From our muscular system, the two things that we really want to look at are increase in force of contraction and then secondly, increase speed of contraction. And obviously, with respect to both the cardiorespiratory and the muscular system, there are quite a number of things that go on in the background to enable these functions to occur. A little bit later we'll have a look at this graph, and essentially we're going to be asking ourselves the questions from a physiological perspective: what changes occur in our body to enable heart rate to increase, to enable speed to increase. So here's a very, very quick overview. Acute responses to exercise from our respiratory system, cardiovascular and muscular systems. There a couple of slides earlier when we looked at increase in oxygen delivery and increase of waste removal, we looked at the cardiorespiratory, and that was basically joining these two systems here together. So from our respiratory system, ventilation is the amount of air that we breathe in and out per minute. So that will increase to increase the amount of oxygen that we can actually get into our system. Diffusion is where we get our gaseous exchange between the alveoli, so the end point of the lungs as such, and going through to the blood. So that will increase. If we have more oxygen going into our blood from our lungs, then theoretically we can deliver more oxygen to our working muscles. From a cardiovascular perspective, oxygen consumption will increase. Now, oxygen consumption here refers to oxygen being used for energy production. Now, energy production, other than being energy being produced in the heart itself. Energy production does occur in the muscles, not in the cardiovascular system itself. Arteriovenous oxygen difference. So this is looking at the difference in oxygen concentration between the arterioles and the venules. This gives us an indirect measure as to the amount of oxygen the muscles are using for energy production. The greater the difference between the arterial and venular oxygen concentration, we can say the harder it is that we're working, because it infers that we're using more oxygen. Cardiac output. So here we're looking at the amount of blood that is pumped out of the heart to the working muscles, so through the left ventricle per minute. If we pump more blood per minute, we are therefore delivering more oxygen per minute, therefore being able to produce a greater amount of aerobic energy in a minute. Venous return. So what changes occur in our body to enable us to increase the rate of blood being returned to the heart? Blood pressure. So we're looking here at the force at which blood is ejected from the heart. Redistribution of blood flow. So we get a much greater amount of blood flow to the working muscles when we exercise. But are there particular internal organs that perhaps don't receive as much blood during exercise as they would at rest, because the body deems it to be more important to get oxygen to our working muscles? So now over to the muscular system. Temperature. When we have chemical reactions, heat is given off. Now the production of energy, or the resynthesis of energy, they're chemical reactions, so heat is given off. Hence when we exercise we get hot. We look at motor unit recruitment. So a motor unit is a neuromuscular synapse. So we've got our axon and the muscle fibers that each of these stimulate. We get our nerve impulse that comes in, gets picked up, gets transported down, and then stimulates these muscle fibers. So that's one motor unit. Depending on the force of muscular contraction required, a number or any number of motor units may well be recruited. The relationship there is the greater the force required, the greater the number of motor units recruited. Energy substrates. When we look at the use of energy substrates, so here we're looking at creatine phosphate, we're looking at glucose or fats. Because they're being used to help in the production of energy, they actually decrease when we do physical activity. They're one of the few things that actually decreases. The majority of acute responses result in increases. Lactate production. Lactate production increases during physical activity, and associated with the lactate we have hydrogen ions. Now hydrogen ions also increase during physical activity. If we have lactate and hydrogen ions, this is when we have lactic acid. So looking at this little graph, here At this point being number 1, we have an increase in the required rate of energy production, because we're now working at a higher intensity. So we're exercising, we're working harder than what we did at rest, so the rate of required energy production has increased. Now this can come from either two sources. We can have it from the anaerobic systems or from the aerobic system. Now, identifying that this table does say that we're working at steady state, meaning that the majority of energy can be met aerobically, the vast majority aerobically. We then have 3 things that will occur to enable us to increase our rate of energy production. Now, we increase the requirement of fuels, these being our carbohydrates or glucose, our fats. We don't look at protein for this. Now, although if we're looking at the aerobic system, we wouldn't be looking at creatine phosphate. However, if we're looking at the ATP PC system, then our creatine phosphate levels will also decrease as a result of them being used. We will increase our oxygen delivery so that again the aerobic system will work more effectively. We have waste products that are built up, so they then need to be removed. Our respiratory system will respond to enable these things to occur. Our cardiovascular system will also respond to enable it to occur, as will our muscular system. So the first thing that we are going to be looking at is ventilation. So ventilation is the amount of air that is breathed in and out per minute. We may see it written as VM, meaning minute ventilation. Whether you see it written as VM or V, it is the amount of air breathed in and out per minute, and it's measured in litres per minute. So how do we get to our ventilation? The first is tidal volume. So tidal volume is the amount of air that we breathe in and out per breath. Our respiratory rate, the number of times we breathe per minute. When we multiply the two together, we get our ventilation. So ventilation equals tidal volume times respiratory rate. Looking at tidal volume again, tidal volume does increase itself as we do physical activity, so we breathe more deeply, meaning that we get a greater supply or a greater amount of air per breath. The point at which our tidal volume is at its maximum we call our vital capacity. So the maximum amount of air we can breathe in and out per breath, vital capacity. So for our ventilation to increase, we can either have an increase in tidal volume or an increase in respiratory rate. However, when we exercise, we will usually have an increase in both. So here's a quick example of how ventilation can be calculated. Note that the values here are slightly different in each table. This is the table of the text that we use. This is a table in one of the other VCE PE texts. So our respiratory rate being 12 times 0.5 equals 6. So ventilation, 6 litres per minute. And how did we calculate that? We take 12 breaths per minute, and in each breath we take in half a litre. So that's at rest. Moderate exercise, we can see that we increase our respiratory rate by quite a lot, from 12 up to 30, then to maximal exercise up to 48 breaths per minute, and tidal volume also from rest to maximal exercises goes up 8-fold. And we can see that at rest we ventilate 6 litres per minute, whereas during maximal exercise it may be up to just under 200 litres per minute. So that's a massive increase in oxygen delivery. Looking at this graph, we have maximal exercise in red and we have submaximal exercise in the blue. So how does ventilation differ? With submaximal exercise, when we start to exercise, we have an initial increase. That's to be able to meet the demands of energy production, because we can't just snap our fingers and immediately produce the required amount. It does take a little bit of time. But once we've met our needs, then our ventilation will plateau, meaning that we're able to meet our needs. Once we stop, we have a decrease in respiration or ventilation, and then as this evens itself out, at this point we will have recovered. Slightly different during maximal exercise. Again, we get our initial very sharp increase to try and make needs. However, at this point our ventilation will continue until we can't ventilate any more. So rather than it plateauing off because we've met our needs, we keep on ventilating as much as we possibly can, but it continues to increase. Once we hit recovery, we get a sharper decrease and then a more moderate period of time before we can get to recovery. So the main difference there is that after our initial rapid rise during maximal exercise, our ventilation will continue to increase. This graph is looking at the difference between ventilation over different intensities. So here we can see that during low, we've had our initial rise, we've been able to meet it, so we plateau off. Recovery during moderate exercise, so we've had our initial rise, but it will continue to rise for a greater period of time, plateau off, we get our decrease as we start to recover. However, during recovery, due to the exercise being harder, we haven't fully recovered in the same period of time. Likewise, with our high, the increase initially is rapid, but will continue to increase. And in this instance, it's not maximal, so the period in time which it plateaus again will be less than that of moderate. Again, during recovery, ventilation decreases, but again, in the same period of time, we won't have been able to recover to the same degree as lower intense activity. Okay, diffusion. So looking at this bit over here, diffusion, we are interested in the lungs with oxygen in the lungs moving into the blood. But likewise, we have here carbon dioxide that's been in the bloodstream, and we want it to enter into the alveoli so that we can breathe it out. So one of the things that happens is when we breathe, our little alveoli sac, because they fill up, will increase in size. And if I just put a blood vessel that would run through there, and here's the same blood vessel, as the alveoli expand, the surface area that's touching between the alveoli and the blood vessel increases. So with this increase in surface area, we've got a greater surface area for diffusion to occur. Things move from a high pressure to a low pressure. So at this point over here, we have a lot of carbon dioxide in the blood. So it's high, it's low in the alveoli, so it will move from the blood to the alveoli. We've breathed in, so we have a high amount of oxygen in the alveoli, a low amount in the blood, so it moves from the alveoli to the blood. So it always moves high to low. Again, over here we have it in two sections. We first of all have it in the lungs or the alveoli. So oxygen from the alveoli into the blood, carbon dioxide from the blood into the alveoli, so that's similar to what we've just looked at over here. Now, although we're looking at the respiratory system here, diffusion does also occur in the muscles, and it's simply the opposite way around. We have a lot of oxygen in the blood, very little in the muscle because it's being used, so oxygen will end up going from the blood into the muscle. We've been using oxygen to produce energy in the muscle, so we have a build-up of carbon dioxide in the muscle. We have a low amount in the blood, so it goes from the muscle to the blood, so it can then be transported to the lungs and breathed out. It is important that we do know the pathway of blood. So this is something to look at with respect to oxygen delivery. So if we start off at the lungs, we breathe the oxygen in, so it's coming in down, it's got to the very end of our lung. It will cross the alveoli membrane into fluid, and the interstitial fluid is the fluid in between the alveoli and the capillary. It will cross the capillary membrane into the plasma, attached to red blood cells. Now it attaches to hemoglobin, which is in the red blood cell. The red blood cell then transports it to the working muscle. So from our lungs, it would then go back into the left atrium through the pulmonary vein into the left ventricle, out through the aorta, being the main artery out of the left ventricle. It would then go to the working muscle. It leaves the red blood cell back through to the plasma, across the capillary membrane, into the interstitial fluid, and into the muscle tissue itself, where it's picked up by myoglobin and transported to the mitochondria, where aerobic energy takes place. We produce carbon dioxide here, which crosses the tissue membrane into the interstitial fluid, across the capillary membrane into the plasma, is attached to the red blood cell. It then gets transported back into the heart. It will come into the heart via the vena cava. It will enter the right atrium, go through to the right ventricle, out the pulmonary artery to the lungs, and here again, red blood cell into the plasma, across the capillary membrane, into the interstitial fluid, across the alveoli membrane. So it's now sitting in the alveoli itself, and then gets breathed out. So our cardiovascular responses to exercise, very similar in essence to our respiratory. Here we are looking at cardiac output. Cardiac output is Q. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped out of the heart per minute. So again, we're looking at litres per minute. So like ventilation, this is made up of two factors. We have stroke volume, which is the amount of blood that's ejected from the left ventricle per beat. And we have heart rate, the number of times our heart beats per minute. So cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate. So when we exercise, if stroke volume increases, then cardiac output will increase. If heart rate increases, cardiac output will increase. And again, during activity, it's common or most common that both stroke volume and heart rate will increase. Again, looking at from a mathematical perspective, stroke volume times heart rate equals cardiac output. Now we do need to remember that cardiac output is measured in litres per minute, stroke volume is measured in mil, and we have 1000 mil equaling 1 litre. So if I was doing the first one, I'd be doing 0.075 litres times 82 equals, and if we look at it on the calculator, we'll actually get 6.15, which is rounding it up to 6.2. This graph is looking at our heart rate and power and oxygen uptake. So as our heart rate increases, the oxygen uptake increases and our power will also increase. And it is a linear relationship. Why does our respiration rate or oxygen uptake increase as heart rate increases? Well, it's because we want to deliver more oxygen to our working muscles. However, if our heart is beating faster, we also need more oxygen to come into our system so that the blood that's passing the alveoli can pick up more oxygen as well. Here we're looking at stroke volume and exercise intensity. So here we can see that as our stroke volume increases, exercise intensity increases. However, there is a maximal level of stroke volume. So once we get to around about 60% VO2 max, we start to get a leveling off of our stroke volume until it's theoretically at its maximal. So this is now mapping stroke volume versus heart rate. So stroke volume's here, heart rate down here. So if we were looking at this, so for example 65 beats per minute, the stroke volume for a trained or untrained athletes is just under 80 mil per beat. For our elite athlete, it's sitting up at around about 95. So one of the chronic adaptations, so an adaptation that occurs due to training over an extended period of time, is that stroke volume does increase. Now, not to confuse that with an acute response. However, the amount of blood that our left ventricle holds in its normal resting state increases over an extended period of time of training aerobically. So what does this actually mean? It means that for an elite athlete, their heart does not have to beat as often to work at the same intensity, because with each beat they're delivering a greater amount of blood to the working muscles, so they're delivering a greater amount of oxygen. So heart rate correlates to the amount of oxygen we want to or need to deliver to our working muscles. So if we look at this graph, Y here has heart rate increased. Well, in this period of time, we have had an increase in activity, which can be seen by the speed. Obviously, when we get to these points, we have a massive increase in activity. If activity increases, then we have an increased required rate of energy production. If our required rate of energy production increases, we need to increase oxygen delivery to our working muscles. So we want to increase our cardiac output. So to increase our cardiac output, we need to increase our heart rate, and as well as that, we will have increased our stroke volume. But this graph specifically is looking at heart rate. blood pressure, we have two measures of blood pressure. So a normal blood pressure at rest would be seen as 120 over, whoops, would be seen as 120 over 80. The 120 is our systolic blood pressure. Our 80 is our diastolic blood pressure. So systolic over diastolic. Systolic refers to the pressure in the arteries as the heart ejects blood out of the left ventricle. The diastolic blood pressure is the pressure in those same arteries when the left ventricle relaxes and fills with blood. Here we can see that with activity that requires a greater intensity of muscular contraction, then the greater our blood pressure is going to be. Now looking at venous return. As the heart can eject only as much blood as it has in its ventricles, it's important for an increase in cardiac output to be accompanied by an increase in venous return. That means we've got blood going out of the heart more quickly, so to enable that to occur, we have to have blood come back to the heart more quickly than it otherwise would have as well. So there's a few ways in which the body works to do this. The first is that the veins have valves in them. This just stops a backflow of blood. The second one to look at is vasoconstriction of veins, meaning that the veins that wrap around, the tissue that surrounds our veins constricts, narrowing the vein itself, so making it harder for backflow. And the last one is what we call a muscular pump. That's being the muscles either side of veins. Because the muscles are contracting and relaxing, they themselves help to pump blood along the veins. So let's have a quick look at what it looks like. So here we can see our muscles contracting. It's squeezing the blood, or helping to squeeze the blood through as they then contract. The next one is looking at something slightly different. It's called our respiratory pump. So as our lungs expand, as we breathe in, it decreases the pressure that is surrounding our right ventricle as it's also increasing, therefore allowing it to fill. Venous return is increasing with a decreased surrounding pressure of the right ventricle. Blood volume decreases, and it decreases quite substantially initially during activity, so it could be by up to 10%. It is the plasma, so it's the liquid part of blood, or the fluid part of blood, that we lose during physical activity, and this essentially is used to help cool the body through our sweating mechanism. The amount of blood volume that's lost will decrease with your ability to appropriately rehydrate. redistribution of blood flow. Here we can see that at rest, the body's pumping around about 5 litres of blood throughout the body. During exercise it could be up to 25 litres. The muscles at rest receive about 20%, or about 1 litre. Here, however, during physical activity, they're receiving around about 84% of the blood, which is up to about 21 litres per minute. Now, interestingly, our brain, although we are receiving 14% and 700 ml during exercise, the percentage decreases to 4%. However, because of a much greater volume of blood passing through the body, our brain doesn't receive in volume a lesser amount. In fact, it goes up to 900 ml. AVO2 difference is looking at the difference in oxygen concentration between the arterioles and the venules. So here in this example we have 20 ml per 100 ml of blood, so 20 ml of oxygen per 100 ml of blood in the arteriole. In the venule we have 14 ml of oxygen per 100 ml of blood, so the difference is 20 minus 14, or AVO2 diff of 6 millilitres of oxygen per 100 ml of blood. The greater the difference, we can say the harder you are working, because it means that we are using more oxygen in our muscles, and that oxygen is used for aerobic energy production. So the greater the amount of aerobic energy production, the harder you are working. So looking at some acute muscular responses, we do have an increased blood flow surrounding our muscles, through our muscles, and what that's going to allow us to have is increased oxygen uptake by the muscles. That's with the myoglobin. And then we'll have increase in oxygen consumption. And remembering, oxygen consumption refers to the use of oxygen for energy production. Okay. Increase in motor unit recruitment. A motor unit is the motor neuron, the axon, and then the muscle fibers that it stimulates. So if we have a look at here, we only want to generate the force that's required. So throwing a cricket ball over 5 meters, we may only activate one motor unit because the force generated or required is not particularly great. If, however, we wanted to throw the ball over 30 meters, then we would recruit a greater number of motor units, meaning that we will greatly increase the amount of force. These motor units over here not being activated, the muscle fibers will still shorten so that muscular contraction can occur normally. However, they shorten without force generation. So our energy substrates, again earlier saying that they are being used. So we have stores of ATP within our muscle. As we do exercise initially, they will decrease and we need to resynthesize them. Creatine phosphate levels will decrease from use within the ATP PC energy system. Our glucose levels will decrease from the use of the anaerobic glycolysis energy system, and also with respect to the aerobic energy system. And our fats will also decrease, and they will be used in the aerobic energy system. So this is looking at glycogen use and levels with respect to a sprint bout or prolonged exercise. Here in the sprint bout, we can see that our fast twitch fibers, their glucose levels will decrease more quickly than slow twitch fibers. Why? These are the ones that are responsible for a greater amount of power because of force and speed, important in sprint. So here we're going to be using predominantly the anaerobic glycolysis energy system, and glucose is its food fuel. And the second one, looking at working through to exhaustion. So here we're looking at 2 hours worth of work. It's endurance, so our slow twitch fibers are going to be used preferentially, and we have both glucose and fats that are used with aerobic energy production. However, this is specifically looking at glucose. So over around about an hour, the glucose levels have dropped quite dramatically. Within our slow twitch fibers, they are still decreasing. Our fast twitch fibers, the glucose level is decreasing also, and it's around about 90 minutes through to 2 hours that it says that we hit the wall. So the term hit the wall means we run out of available carbohydrates in the body. We don't run out of all carbohydrate in the body. If we do, we'd be dead because our brain requires glucose. So it's running out of available carbohydrate for physical activity. Unless, of course, you're ingesting carbohydrate. Body temperature will increase as a result of physical activity because heat is released with the resynthesis of energy. So here, body accommodates these changes by stimulating the sweat glands. We have an increased blood flow to the skin so that we can, with convection, so that blood vessels dilate near the skin, so heat can then escape to the outside. The cool environment will then penetrate the blood, remembering that things move from a high concentration to a low concentration, so a high concentration of heat in the blood, low concentration of heat in the atmosphere. So that works well if it's cool environment. If it's a hot, muggy environment, then that doesn't work particularly well. Looking at oxygen consumption during low to moderate physical activity, we start to exercise and our oxygen consumption increases to meet our demands, and fairly early on in activity we will actually meet our demands, so our oxygen uptake stays similar. Then as we recover, our oxygen consumption slowly goes down. The blue area here is what we refer to as oxygen deficit. It's the amount of energy that is produced by the anaerobic energy systems as we wait for our body to actually meet the aerobic demands. So our heart rate has to increase, respiration has to increase, stroke volume has to increase to be able to meet the oxygen delivery needs. If we're working at a maximal level, there's every chance that our oxygen deficit will actually remain for almost all the amount of time of physical activity. This cannot last for particularly long if you're working at that intensity. Now, the point in time where oxygen uptake has plateaued, so this bit through here, this is said to be at steady state. Table 4.3 from our text. Here are a set of values that is certainly worth knowing. And also table 4.4 is a table summary of the acute responses. I'm just trying to stop